こんにちは。ワールドヒストリーアディクスポッドキャストへようこそ。ホストのデボンです。今日は日本の歴史についての3部作を始めたいと思います。日本は世界で最もユニークでありながら、よく知られている国の一つです。その歴史は何千年も前に遡り、そこからこの物語が始まります。日本最古の歴史の記録。大和民族の形成、そして国を統一した最初の将軍政権が生まれた戦争までをたどっていきます。それでは、始めましょう。Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts Podcast. I'm your host, Devin, and today I will be starting a 3-part series about the history of Japan, one of the most unique yet well-known countries in the world. Japan's history goes back for thousands of years, and that is where we will begin the story. From the earliest records of civilization in Japan, to the formation of the Yamato people as a distinct group, to the wars that created the first shogunate that unified the country. Let's begin. Japan began a very long time ago, and that's not even counting the 1800s, because the modern nation-state of Japan didn't exist until the 19th century, or even the 20th century if you count the current Japanese state post-World War II. But the samurai and the Japanese language and the Japanese culture existed far before that. So as a distinct cultural and geographic entity, it began around 2,000 years ago, and that makes it older than virtually every country in Europe outside of Italy and Greece, and pretty much the rest of the world outside of a very few ancient civilizations like China, Persia, India, Israel, and possibly Egypt or Armenia. And it's for this reason that Japan has an incredibly long and unique history, particularly in its continuity, as the first mythical ruler of Japan was the Emperor Jimmu, whose royal line is still around today in 2025, and this royal family has remained in power for over 2,000 years. Which goes back to the very, very beginning of Japan, all the way back to the prehistoric era. This is called the Jomon period. It goes all the way back to 14,000 years ago, or 16,000 years ago, and 14,000 BC, back to the age of the mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers. This was Japan's Stone Age, and it lasted all the way until the Yayoi period, which began in 300 BC, which is around the same time as the conquest of Alexander the Great, as well as the era of the Buddha in India. And it was also a century after the end of the Olmec civilization in pre-Columbian Mexico. So Japan's actual start as a civilization, while old, was actually after several other well-known civilizations at this point in time. The Yayoi period, which was from 300 BC to 300 AD, saw the migration of people from Korea to southern Japan. They displaced or they mixed with the native Jomon people, and they began importing rice farming, which started to make hunting and gathering obsolete. The current people of Japan are actually not the first people. They're not the Jomon people. They're actually a mix of both the Jomon, that being the hunter-gatherers who were there for thousands and thousands of years into the prehistoric age, and the later Yayoi or Wajin people, those being the classical era rice farmers with Bronze Age technology, who showed up around the same time as Alexander the Great and the beginnings of the Roman Republic. And that leads to the larger story of what Japan actually is. It's really the story of mainland migrants from East Asia moving into from China and Korea into southern Japan, and then migrating east and north, pushing the pre-existing people further and further up the island chain. Now, the Yayoi period was followed by the Kofun era, which lasted until the early 500s AD, and that's right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire and around the start of the Middle Ages in Europe, or the clashes between the Eastern Roman Empire and the final dynasty of Persia called the Sasanians. And it's also when the Yayoi Jomon people finally crystallize into the group that eventually becomes the ancestors of the current Japanese today called the Yamato people. And the Kofun era is named after these gigantic keyhole-shaped tombs located all around Japan. It was where all the important people were buried. And after that, the Asuka period was named after the city of Asuka, which was the capital of Nara Prefecture, where the Yamato clan ruled and also became the most powerful. It's also around this era that there was a migration of Han Chinese people from mainland China into Japan, which influenced the gene pool, and they're called the Toraijin. But that also includes Korea and other people from mainland Asia, because there were many different migrations into Japan that later shapes its genetic makeup. Now, one of the interesting theories I came across, which hasn't been entirely proven and is very dubious, is the horse rider theory, which says that there was a steppe nomad element in early Japanese history coming from the northern part of Korea or even from Siberia, who conquered Japan, displaced the indigenous tribes, and implanted a horse culture, which lived on into the medieval and the early modern eras. And I find this really interesting because there's an unrelated theory known as Turanism, which argues that there's a gigantic family of Central Asian nomads starting somewhere in the Altai Mountains. That's in Siberia. It's between Siberia and northwestern China, and it's supposed to be where Attila the Hun's people came from. And all of their descendants include the Finns in Finland, the Hungarians, known before as the Magyars, but I'm going to do a separate video on them. The Turks, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the Turkmen, the Kyrgyz, the Manchus of northeastern China and Manchuria, the Mongols, and sometimes even Korea and Japan. So if we compare Japan's history to that of England, this time period is very similar to the early medieval era in England, where the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, all being migrants and invaders from Denmark and northern Germany, began mixing with and displacing the pre-existing indigenous Celtic Britons and the remnants of the Roman settlers. You just swap out the Celtic Britons and the Romans with the Jomon and the northern Germanic migrants for the Yayoi. And it should also be kept in mind that this was Japan before the samurai. It's a very obscure kind of era, but you can see, I would say, kind of echoes of it in certain types of Japanese media, like Miyazaki's films. I think many of the aesthetics in some of his movies are actually based on this very early era of Japan. The early Japanese warriors fought more like Chinese or Korean ones, that they relied more on heavy infantry with swords and shields. But as you'll see later, Japan's military and combat tradition develops in a very different way that de-emphasizes the shield and any kind of one-handed weapon and puts the focus on two-handed polearms, cavalry, and archers. That doesn't mean they never used shields, because the tate was a rectangular one-handed shield that the Japanese infantry would use, and the swords before the rise of the more famous two-handed curved swords like the katana or the itachi are known as the tsurugi, the chokudo, the ken, and they were all straight swords with double-edged blades, and they were based on Chinese designs. And these are the types of weapons that the Japanese would have used against each other, and in the one foreign war that they seem to be involved in, which is the unification wars of Korea in the late 300s and the early 400s, between the North Korean kingdom of Goguryeo and its ally, the kingdom of Silla in southeast Korea, against the Baekje kingdom and the Aragaya Confederacy. And that latter group were allied with the kingdom of Wa, which was based in Kyushu, and that's the southernmost island of Japan. So because of its geography and its location, which is at the northeasternmost edge of Asia, Japan doesn't have very many foreign influences at this point in time. This is well before the appearance of the European colonial powers. So it really has only two or three main influences. The first one, of course, is China, because China influenced every nation in its vicinity, and indirectly Korea, because that's where Buddhism eventually moves into Japan, and technically three if you count India as the birthplace of Buddhism. But it only arrives there in the 600s AD, which is actually pretty late, considering this is also when the rise of Islam was going on in the Middle East. So in the 600s and the 700s, that's the end of the Asuka era and the beginning of the shorter Nara period. Japan goes out of its way to copy the Tang Dynasty in China, because the Tang Dynasty is I think one of China's most famous and probably its most respected dynasty. It was very powerful, and it came up with many different inventions, especially relative to the rest of the world at the time. And some of these inventions included early animatronic puppets, the movable type, which was kind of like the later printers and typewriters and the printing press in Europe. But this was about 800 years before that, and early mechanical clocks too. And in the mid-600s, the Taika reforms took place, which are also counted as the end of the Asuka era and the beginning of the Nara period. And they were built around making Japan more like China in its imperial court and collectivizing the land and adopting China's writing system and architecture style. And you can tell this because the city of Nara was intentionally copied off of the Tang Dynasty's capital known as Chang'an. It's also at this point in time that there's a distinction being made between the Yamato people and the unassimilated Emishi or indigenous Japanese, in that they're not really a foreign people because they were in Japan first, but they are, by this point, a distinctively different group from the Japanese Yamato. And they're also one of the reasons why their way of warfare changes so drastically opposed to other parts of Asia. Another thing to keep in mind is that Japan's religion before Buddhism arrived was known as Shinto. It is still very prevalent even today. And much of these Shinto traditions actually draw from the indigenous pre-Yamato mythology that the Emishi and other indigenous people had. There's also the Ryukyuans. That's another group. They're very debatably Japanese. I'm actually part Okinawan myself, and I think at this point the Okinawans have been largely assimilated into Japan, but at this point in time they would have definitely been considered a bit. They would have been considered a separate people from the Japanese. Incorporation comes much later in history. And there's one lesser group that also influenced Japan, and they're called the Hayato, and not much is known about them. It's not entirely clear where they came from, but it's suspected based on the way that they're described by the records that they came from somewhere in Taiwan or maybe from somewhere in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines or Indonesia. And it's suspected that there were trace amounts of Austronesian words, that's like Southeast Asian words, that somehow got into the Japanese language. And that leads to the main question, which is probably the reason many people know about Japan in the first place, and that's the samurai. So the samurai began in the late stages of pre-shogunate Japan, which is the Heian period. And that was named after yet another capital city called Heian-kyo, which replaced Nara as the imperial capital. And this era is Japan's equivalent to the early and high Middle Ages, and then it spans from the 700s, which is around the same time as the Vikings and the invasion of Spain by the Moors, and it lasts into the age of the Crusades. It's also where Japan's culture starts to take on its own character, because up until then, it had relied heavily on copying ideas, institutions, and even art styles and writing systems from China, but now that was starting to decline. At this point in time, China was going through a collapse because there was a civil war going on called the Anlushan Rebellion in China. And in the early 800s, there was also a gigantic smallpox epidemic that killed off around half of Japan's population. And I think this is one of the reasons why Japan was much harder to invade and conquer compared to other isolated parts of the world, because the Japanese gene pool had already gone through a massive selection for immunity, and the survivors were just more resistant to diseases. So it wasn't as the same as, say, in the Americas, where entire empires started being devastated because that when the Europeans arrived, they brought all types of diseases that they'd never encountered before, and it just ravaged the entire ecosystem. So the original reason for the samurai, but at that point they're called the bushi, or servants, was outside of providing decentralized security when the main government was weak, was actually expeditions to the northern part of Japan that wasn't under the control of the Yamato people, but was still where the Emishi people lived. On a side note, the movie Princess Mononoke actually features an Emishi prince as the main character. Prince Ashitaka is supposed to be one of the Emishi people, but it takes place in the 1500s, which is not entirely historical, because according to the records, the Emishi people actually disappeared all the way back before the 1100s, or the year 10,000 as a real distinct group. And this also relates to the aforementioned development of Japanese arms and warfare, because the Yamato armies were originally like those in Europe and China. They had infantry with shields, they had swords and axes or spears in their main hands. But the nomadic Emishi tribes required the Japanese to adapt and and the samurai had to become a class of mounted archers and medium cavalry, as opposed to the light cavalry of the nomadic tribes like the Mongols or the Turks, or the heavy cavalry such as those in Europe, like the knights. So the samurai would become more similar to the knights of Europe at a later point, but they started out much more similar to the Texas Rangers or the Cossacks or even the Portuguese explorers who headed out into Brazil. They were a mounted frontier force designed to counter nomadic indigenous tribes. And as mentioned before, the subsequent expansion and rise of the samurai into power was also due to autonomization within Japan, and that the central imperial court began to weaken and local authorities began taking more power for themselves, and that meant relying on their own specialized warrior nobility who were loyal specifically to them. And from here, three clans begin vying for more influence. You got the Taira clan, you got the Minamoto clan, and you got the Fujiwara clan. So what began the era of the shogunate? It was the rivalry between these three clans that spiraled out into an all-out war. So originally, the Fujiwara clan was the most powerful out of the three, and they had virtual control over the throne that goes all the way back to the 800s. The emperors of Japan had been known to leave the throne, but still continued to have power even outside of them officially being the emperor, and they became known as the cloistered emperors, or insei. And this created a problem because the Taira and the Minamoto clans could use these emperors who weren't officially in power but still had a lot of influence as a loophole to bypass Fujiwara power. And eventually they became the two main factions of Japan. So in 1156, there was the Hogan Rebellion, and that was because the Emperor Konoe died in 1155, and that led to a succession crisis between the rival claimants Go Shirakawa, and who was backed by Taira no Kiyomori, and Minamoto Yoshitomo, along with Fujiwara no Tadamichi. The opposition was the former Emperor Sutoku, backed by Fujiwara no Yorinaga, and Minamoto no Tamayoshi, who interestingly was actually the father of Minamoto Yoshitomo on the other side. And this is important because Yoshitomo actually betrayed his own father, and this led to Go Shirakawa taking power. And 4 years later, you have the Heiji disturbance, and that happened because the Go Shirakawa, the new emperor, started to clash with his emperor, Fujiwara no Nobuyori, and Yoshitomo actually sided with the chancellor against the emperor. But despite this, the Taira clan fought and defeated a combined Minamoto and Fujiwara force inside the capital city of Kyoto, which was formerly known as Heian-kyo, and he actually killed Yoshitomo as he tried to escape from the city. So by this point, Taira no Kiyomori is the most powerful man in Japan. He's the kingmaker, and he's able to determine imperial succession. But the problem is this alienates both the rival samurai and the imperial nobles, because he's really not supposed to be doing this. Now, 20 years later, and this is in 1180, one of Go Shirakawa's sons is named Prince Mochihiro, was passed over for succession, largely because of Taira no Kiyomori's meddling. And in fact, Taira actually installs one of his own grandsons named Antoku, and that leads to the Minamoto and the Taira clans fighting each other in the Genpei War that lasts for another 5 years. And this I see as Japan's War of the Roses or the English Civil War. It was an entirely internal conflict within Japan, like the way that the War of the Roses the English Civil War wasn't entirely within England because it also spilled out into Scotland and Ireland. But the War of the Roses was fought mostly within different English families trying to take over the country. In this case, I draw the connection between the English Civil War and Japan's Genpei War because it was also a war between royalists and a non-royalist faction. In their case, it was emperors versus the samurai. But in the English case, it was the parliament versus the royal loyalists. And in both cases, it led to a military dictator taking over. The Battle of Uji began outside of modern-day Kyoto, and which is where the war began. And weirdly enough, the last major battle of the Genpei War was actually a naval battle in the Straits of Shimonoseki. That's the southern waterway that separates the largest Japanese island called Honshu from the southernmost island I mentioned earlier called Kyushu. And it was fought with archers on boats and boarding parties who were trying to jump onto each other's ships to attack them. Antoku ended up drowning, and the leadership of the Taira clan was killed off by the Minamoto clan. And Minamoto Yoshitomo's son, Minamoto Yoritomo, became the leader of the victorious clan, and he would eventually become the first shogun in 1192, which is the same year as the end of the Third Crusade, which was launched to take back Jerusalem from the Arab leader Salah ad-Din. Now, the shogun is a military position. It's not a royal position like the emperor. And it functions as the leader of the daimyo, and the daimyo are the leaders of the samurai. And medieval Europe doesn't have any figures who are comparable to a shogun unless we count, at least not in the medieval period, unless we extend that into the early modern era, in which Oliver Cromwell, who was the victor of the English Civil War, is really, I think, the closest that Europe has to a shogun. Though, that being said, I would argue that later fascist leaders in the 20th century, like Mussolini or Ion Antonescu of Romania, are very similar in function to the shoguns. And I think this becomes important later because with the rise of a very similar regime in 20th century Japan, but that's a story for another episode. In conclusion to this early history of Japan, what I think we can take away is that history often rhymes across cultures. You can see many parallels between the early history of Japan and the early history of Britain or England, and that both countries were island nations that were founded largely by outside invaders and migrants who took influences from the mainland continent, but eventually turned into their own unique culture featuring a warrior elite class, and they went through civil wars that established a military ruler who replaced a monarch. Isolation affects a country's development pretty profoundly because ancient Japan was actually a very primitive society and very strange even then because it adopted Buddhism at a pretty late date, around the same time that Islam was appearing in Arabia. And it only became centralized with the efforts to model Japan after the Tang Dynasty. And even in the present day, Japan is one of the last of the countries that still have a strong polytheistic tradition. The only other one is India and maybe Nepal. And in the rest of the world, it still exists, like in Africa, but it's largely been suppressed by Christian missionaries or by Muslims. Another point is centralism versus localism. The Japanese imperial court wanted to make Japan a copy of China, but the local samurai clans rebelled against this, and they actually ended up making Japan more Japanese. It's also important to note that it isn't just Western settler colonies like America or Australia who have indigenous people. The story of Japan is a very long war spanning over 1,000 years between the Yamato people of modern Japan against the indigenous Jomon, Emishi, and the Ainu people of prehistoric Japan. Today we view the samurai as legendary, honorable warriors with unstoppable swords, but really at the time they were another political bloc, just like the different royal lines, and their eventual takeover of Japan after the Genpei War eventually overturned the older traditions of rule by the emperor. In the 20th century, Mao Zedong said, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, but in the 12th century, the principle was actually still the same, even if power grew out of a katana or a Japanese longbow instead. Because even in this isolated ecosystem, there were still major upheavals and dynamic changes, such as the move from an imperial system to a shogunate. Because I think wherever competition exists, change naturally springs out of it, and we'll see where that leads. Thank you for listening in. You can follow the podcast at the World History Addicts Podcast account on Instagram for new episodes and releases. Part 2 of the history of Japan will be released soon and will be about the Kamakura shogunate and the early modern history of Japan, leading up to the reestablishment of the emperor. See you there soon.